Chapter 9.
The French and Indian War still going on. It took Dixie 10 minutes to cross another pit-infested field after the first one, and another 24 minutes for him to finally get over the humiliation of being trapped before he wondered if heading towards that tower was ultimately worth it. Climbing up another nearby hill, Dixie saw it again. Beyond a small wood he had crossed beyond field pits, the Golden Tower stood more or less in front of him, across what looked like a gigantic valley covered with dark forest. He had come to the edge of an immense bowl-shaped ravine that led into the valley. The ravine was so large that towards his left it encircled the valley for miles upon miles. To his right, the encircling ravine disappeared along the horizon. "This thing has got to be bigger than the Grand Canyon," he gawked in amazement. Dixie must have walked diagonally because he noticed the tower was a bit more towards his left. But at least it appeared just a smidgen closer than before. As he looked behind him, he could still see the towering slopes of Mount Muad'Dib and all the dark woods running along the northern edge of the mountain. It was now much smaller than it was before. Going back towards the mountain still felt like a comforting idea, but that strange golden tower was calling his name in a way he couldn't rationalize. How is it that we've never been told about this place? Dixie wondered. He just couldn't get over the fact that nowhere back home was there ever any description of Anakaland being such a fertile land instead of the moonscape the authorities had always claimed it to be. That is, if this really was Anakaland. But then what's all this? How does any of this make sense? He wondered. Stumbling for his caratless phone, Dixie looked at it, hoping the mysterious speaker would magically show up and give him some answers. "What was the point of you talking to me if you leave me right here by myself when I really need you?" he shouted at it. Wow. Perhaps a little too loud. He could hear the echo of his own voice trail off in the valley, followed by soft animal sounds, and then a barely audible chorus of laughter that sounded rough and gravelly. It sounded like the multitude of soft voices, and they were coming from the woods he had just left, and it froze him stiff. It freaked him out so much that, with the slow speed of a hiker praying to get to the restroom before tragedy struck, he walked straight towards the valley, completely stiff-legged and without reservation. Dixie crossed another cluster of trees and finally began to descend the slope of the massive ravine. This side of the valley was covered with pine trees, and the steepness of the slope made for slow travel. For a while, he couldn't even see any clearing ahead because the trees were so thick. It was only after a couple more hours or so of stumbling through the woods and guessing the general direction of the tower that it hit him how foolish he had been to do this. "I let the fear of those zombies screw me over," he thought to himself. "I should have looked around. I should at least have grabbed some more of those gummy thingies, but when I woke up, what the hell am I going to do for food? Why didn't I pack?" The kid had even stumbled onto a peach tree growing nearer to the slopes of Mount Muad'Dib a while ago by vine country right after his adventures in the Great Gravity Door. But being the ill-prepared bonehead that he was, he forgot to shove several in his pocket after eating a bunch of them off the tree. To make things worse, it was finally starting to get dark out, if the sky, now turning pinkish purple, could be considered a dusk, not to mention colder. This put him in an ill mood. But then suddenly, just as if the luminescence of darker daylight was nothing more than an overcast, the sky got clear and bright again, almost a brighter pink. It was as if a day had completely reset itself in record speed in this alien world. Maybe it was the reset luminescence in the sky playing a number on his circadian rhythms. Or maybe it was adrenaline. But Dixie caught a second wind. It was a good thing, too, because he figured he might as well cover as much ground as he could to reach that tower. Then a terrible thought came to him. What if that tower is abandoned? He asked himself. Yeah, that would be great. All this traveling for nothing. But his more sensible side remained resolute. He knew it would kill him if he didn't at least try to reach that thing. I mean, it's the most sensible route, he kept saying to himself. There's either supplies there, or I could get directions out there, or I guess I could finally head home. If heading in this direction was a huge mistake, then the sooner he found out, the sooner he could at least be at peace and know that he at least tried to save the world. How stupid is that, he thought to himself. That is the reality, it seems. Why else should I be here? Me saving the world is the stupidest love story in the history of the planet. Why did he even want to? But he already knew the answer to that question. Chili's never going to believe this. Chili. He missed her immensely. Her strong spirit and ability to problem solve in a tight spot would have been so useful right now, not to mention the companionship. Why couldn't she have been picked to do this, he wondered. But he already knew the answer to that question too. He would never wish this upon her either. She might be more hero material than he was, but neither of them were really action hero material at all. They were posers. They liked to ponder deep ideas and wish they could solve the world's problems. But when push came to shove, he realized that most likely they did not have what it took to change a damn thing. They wouldn't even stand up for their beliefs recently about how they felt about the system. They already had sold out to their parents' idea of agreeing to go to an overpriced college, let alone fight against human inequality if it inconvenienced them. Who am I kidding? We're self-righteous bastards, Dixie thought to himself. When all was said and done, they certainly didn't tackle bigger existential issues, such as saving the damn planet, he considered as he continued to trek down the slope. Dixie grabbed the branch of a tree and let himself slide several yards until crashing onto another to steady his footing again. It's kind of a little extreme to put me in this situation, don't you think? He shouted. Dixie wanted to talk to someone right now. It wasn't fair. By right, somebody ought to hear him speak his mind. Perhaps God, or maybe the cosmos, or fate, or maybe the planet itself. Or maybe that damn speaker on the telephone thing, Dixie groaned. He pulled out the carrotless device again and opened it. Still, no signal, no glowing, no nothing. You could have at least given me a milder challenge to warm up with before throwing me into this adventure movie, don't you think? He shouted. He was far from happy. He had just slid down a steep area covered in pine needles that caused him to slide fast and slam into a branch that sliced his left arm. The day continued. After another 40 minutes of trekking through this dark forest-covered slope, Dixie stumbled onto another miracle. Wrapped in another one of those organic popcorn bags was another one of those tasty delicacies of so-called gummy candies. Same shapes, like those large head statues found on Easter Island in the Pacific. Dixie had never taken performance-enhancing supplements in his life, but he wondered if the feeling of super energy he was experiencing from these things was permissively natural. He found it curious that for all the strange daydreams and thoughts that went in his head on a typical day, this was the first time ever he actually found himself experiencing the kind of anxiety a pro athlete must feel in terms of their concern about organ damage in their later years. A slight feeling of anxiety unfolded, and for 40 minutes, Dixie kept repeating to himself, "It's not a steroid, it's not a steroid," over and over again as he walked down the slope, until he realized he had forgotten to actually grab the bag of gummy candy thingies once again. Recognizing how incompetent he truly was, Dixie felt he had no other choice but reflect the obvious. Why the hell didn't I just go and check out the ski lodge, he thought out loud. There must be someone over there if that really was Mount Muhadeu. I was right there. It was the most logical thought he had had all day, but unfortunately, it was late in coming. Abandoned or not, it might have provided him a reasonable shelter. Regrettably, Dixie had already stumbled too far through this country of dark fir and deciduous trees to turn around. It seemed just as rational to continue on and try his luck with the Golden Tower. Suddenly, Dixie stumbled onto a thick patch of pine forest that really sloped down into a steep incline for quite a distance. It was so bad in certain areas that Dixie felt like he was scaling down a cliff, and he literally had to find ways to grab onto one tree branch and swing onto another one just to keep himself from tumbling down the slope. After several hundred yards down, the pine forest hit a clearing ahead that was wide enough for him to finally see beyond the tops of the trees ahead of the slope. When he reached this meadow, he saw the gigantic valley ahead in more detail. He was near the bottom now, and it looked like this pine forest was on the very edge of it. The flat valley looked like the bottom of an egg-shaped pan with surrounding tree-filled ridges all around. Must have really made progress, he thought. But now I'm going to have to trek up that ridiculous slope on the other side. At least, from the vantage point of where he was standing, he could see that he was still moving in the same general direction of the tower far ahead. It made no sense to backtrack and go around the edge of this gigantic valley anymore. Walking along the edge of that arc length would have taken him 3 times as long. On the other hand, he was about to descend into an ominous dark forest below. He wondered if he would be able to see the sky as well down there through those thick trees. Dixie continued down the last half mile of the slope. The sky had darkened to a dimmer pinkish-purple hue again, and he could see a haze starting to cover the middle of the valley below. It felt like dusk, or a very late afternoon on a winter day. If you can make it to the promised land where all your problems will be over, Dixie remembered the mysterious speaker on the other line of his mystical cell phone once saying to him, all of this will start to make more sense. And where is that? Where were these hollow earths? Dixie wondered. He tried to logically think of a better option than plunging down into this large bowl-shaped valley, but he couldn't think of anything more practical. So with an expletive, Dixie continued down the slope and into the encasing pine tree forest. He figured he had a day's journey hike to the other side, and not counting maybe a 3-hour hike up the other slope. He was exhausted now, and the fact he was a mortal being who would eventually need to eat weighed on his mind. He figured the best way for him to not think about food was to lose consciousness. Finding a nice pile of leaves under a large beech tree that seemed out of place in the middle of all these pines, Dixie finally let himself pass out and stop worrying about his mortality. He woke up considerably later, as far as he could tell. Although he couldn't tell exactly what time it was, the pink sky above him was now much brighter. Regardless, he got up, stretched, and wished for a good breakfast. Pretty much impossible here, he thought. But maybe there's a banquet waiting in that tower for travelers that bravely wander into Anakaland. Maybe there is a resort, he hoped. It was lucky for him that he was imprudent, because as far as he could tell, there was no sense debating what to do next. Remembering what he had seen on the slope, it was going to be about 2 more hours through deep forest, with hopefully no dirtbag foes to encounter along the way, before he stumbled onto some areas of grassy plains that he had seen from the top of the ravine. If he didn't want to stick around this ominous wood, he was going to need to trek through it as fast as possible. This has got to be the most reckless journey I've ever been in, he lamented. No money, no warm clothing, and no camping gear either. Who the hell sends a person on an expedition to save the world from the end of its cycle of time without at least some sort of compass and a whistle? He thought again. That settled it in his mind. Rushing recklessly to get to Anakaland was easily the stupidest decision he had ever made in his life. After almost being ready to weep because of his failure to bring anything on this journey, Dixie came to his senses and realized lamenting was pointless. He continued his journey. Here and there, the birds were chirping. It was almost mockery. Such beautiful sounds and sights surrounding a witless wanderer like himself before he probably met his demise. Eventually, after another half hour of strolling through deep forest, he reasoned that there was no way he would be able to bring expensive gear with him on this quest anyway. How could he have been able to take it with him through the great gravity door? This continuous circular trail of logic in his mind buoyed his spirits a little, even if it was most likely he was going to starve out here and die of exposure. There have got to be more of those gummy plant thingies around here, he thought. He kept an eye out for him, but doing so was slowing his pace. Dixie reached in his pocket and, once again, squeezed his extraterrestrial cell phone thing for comfort. Mind working on autopilot, he pulled it out and immediately resolved to call the mysterious speaker. Shit, still no power, he cursed out loud to himself. What was he thinking? He had already checked it up on the slope. He wondered if that strange substance the speaker had hinted at was around these parts. That strange, what was it called? Vorchinemium? Something or other? Ugh, Dixie grunted. He finally had left the pine forest, and feeling grim, he hiked rapidly through several sections of woods, filled with birch trees and poplars with less shade. Without a breakfast, he was not feeling too positive about things. If this was going to be his end, he would make it such a ridiculously valiant effort that it would be legendary. But to do that, he would have to at least reach that giant golden tower in the distance one way or another. Beg for food when you get there, he cheered himself, and ask to properly use the bathroom even if they don't give you shelter. Who are we kidding? They'd be so lonely they'd want company. As he passed through a red-leaf, birch tree-covered forest, Dixie once again found himself slamming into another region of deciduous trees and firs further ahead. In the distance, he heard the sound of either thunderclaps or cannons firing. They continued for a few moments and then ceased, leaving him in silence with nothing but the faint cries of chirping birds again. At this point, the ground began to descend again. There was a growing haze amidst some of the trees further below, but to his great relief he could distinguish jagged-looking ruins all over the forest floor. The scattered remnants of a civilization certainly were a welcoming sight. Again, he heard the thunderclaps repeatedly coming from the area he was heading towards. They were getting louder. "Come on, man," he said as he tried to psych himself up. "It can't be any more dangerous over there than that skydiving door or getting chased by zombies." He forced himself to continue through the woods. It was good that at least he was thinking positive. The ruins he was passing by in the woods were battered remains of many constructs celebrating 18th century French colonial architecture. Dixie's book Esoteric Myths had briefly touched on the existence of these monuments. Somewhere in the deep valleys of Anakaland, it said, lay a region where it was still believed the French and Indian War of the 1700s was still going on. The author had speculated that entire communities of French colonials, redcoats, and Native Americans had somehow been caught in a time-space warp during some foul play with black magic in the ancient Americas. Something about hearsay from other reports. Although, of course, this would have been strange, seeing how, well, Anakaland was nowhere near such regions. How any of that was possible was beyond the author's skill to explain. But here was Dixie walking amongst ruins that fit those descriptions. And what these buildings were doing here was a complete mystery to him. But he was relieved to find familiar human settlements, at least. Another louder clap of thunder was heard. Or was that cannon fire? Followed by what sounded like an explosion and a sudden faint shriek that emanated from the valley ahead. It was all too unnerving, and it was coming from the direction Dixie was heading. He passed more pine glades and occasionally what looked like the ruins of a stucco building of some sort with a few of its walls missing. As he studied one of them, it was evident that it had suffered a shelling. In another spot around the woods, Dixie would pass by piles of old wagon wheels or various ancient monuments half buried in the ground. They were covered in moss and looked so weathered that their features were almost indistinguishable. Some of these appeared as the shape of a warrior standing on a podium with what either looked like a long pointy helmet or an enormously long pointy head. Others were holding a short staff, while others looked like they were carrying some sort of ancient rifle. Other monuments were the busts of someone's giant head. In particular, the giant heads all appeared to resemble the same large face. A bearded young man with unkempt hair and wearing a low-fitting rimmed hat that looked like the kind a Cuban soldier or some expendable South America guerrilla soldier movie extra would be wearing in a bad action film. Dixie considered if the bust was a familiar face he should be able to recognize. But the white limestone was so corroded that half of the statue seemed to be missing any further distinguishable facial features. After a 15-minute trek further down, Dixie stumbled onto an elegant leather boot, which was most unexpected. It would have seemed a welcoming sight had it not been for the fact that upon further inspection, it still had a leg in it. "Saint Mother of Earth!" screamed Dixie. "That's the most messed up thing I've seen and I've seen a lot of effed up, fucked up things." Leaving the boot, Dixie immediately thought about heading back up the slope. But just like a person who hates their daily routine but doesn't do anything about it, Dixie felt destined to continue down the valley towards the haze. After another 30 minutes down a slight decline through some half-blasted pine trees, the ground started to flatten out a bit. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of bedlam became more frequent. Dixie stared at his magic cell phone thingy. Still, no reception. There was probably no reception in this valley anyways. He picked up the pace and continued through the forest, ready to get whatever was waiting before him over with. The thunderclaps got louder and clearer in the distance to the point where they became the unmistakable sounds of cannon fire. And the damaged 18th century ruins and houses and stucco forts became more frequent. There were many other scattered items that looked like they had been tossed all over the forest. A broken arrow or a tomahawk on the ground half buried below the sand. Other items could be lying on the ground here and there that looked rustic and ancient. But Dixie was amazed at what he finally saw. It wasn't the slight scorched earth or even the evidence that some ancient battle had taken place here that caught his attention. It was the small caravans of real live humans that came pouring out of the trees to his right. They seemed to be running away from what sounded like battle in the distance. Virtually all of them were dressed in 18th century French colonial military garb, suits that were over 3 centuries behind in fashion. He could have jumped for joy, but upon observing the scene, his face turned to a frown. too confused to process what was going on. Some were hobbling or assisting each other in some manner and headed almost perpendicular to the direction Dixie had been going and quickly away from the direction of the thick haze coming from the middle of the valley. It took a few moments for Dixie to stop a few of them in their tracks and turn their attention to him. Quetzalcoatlus? I have no idea what that means, replied one of them in a thick French accent.
What happened?
Replied another one who was wearing a brown leather vest under a puffy shirt and a large band-aid wrapped around his eye.
We got waylaid, that's what. Move along, monsieur. The lobsterbacks will be here any moment. No, I can't explain any of this,
said another with a perfect post-American accent, as he hurried as fast as he could with the caravan of beat-up soldiers towards a trail under some of the trees to Dixie's left. He sounded like he was from Queens. You should have been out by the front if you wanted to see what was going on, retorted another soldier, who was helping a wounded comrade with 2 missing arms and a sprained ankle as he still hurried on by. For several minutes, Dixie tried to stop more of the passing refugees, but none of them wanted to talk to him. It was obvious they were trying to get out of these woods as fast as possible. I will elaborate for you, sir, came a soft, deep voice from behind him. The voice was quiet, yet brimming with stoic confidence, despite the debacle all around. Dixie turned and saw a large, athletically built man in his 50s, about 6 feet tall, with long silver hair, a grayish-black trim beard, and blue eyes. He was just sitting there, cross-legged, watching the wretched procession of wounded walk by and brooding calmly. And he was wearing the buckskin getup of a foreign trapper or ancient explorer. And despite the evidently limited weapons technology most of the rest of the caravan of refugees seemed to be carrying with them, he had a modern sniper rifle and several other firearms strapped to his person. On his front, he had a couple more weapons shoved into his 2 bandoliers wrapped around his chest that could have been either for reserve ammunition or just plain intimidation. He also happened to be carrying a large halberd strapped to his back, made out of some glowing plasma-like technology that almost made it look cartoonish. He was rugged and handsome as well. Dixie pegged him as a local action hero or a retired male runway model who was sporting French trapper fashions that had somehow gotten lost in Anakaland. If Pancho Villa physically fused with Davy Crockett and then met Daniel Day-Lewis from Last of the Mohicans and then met a pro wrestler, this is what their hybrid would have looked like. Dixie had not noticed him before, but somehow he had appeared on the large round boulder behind them. The man followed Dixie's gaze with a quick explanation that he had arrived only a few minutes prior. But I might know more than you, at any rate, the stranger added. Dixie liked the stranger's style. He fit in with the supernatural environment here. And Dixie had enough sense to play his cards right before his big mouth probably said something offensive. I don't mean to be an inconvenience, sir, Dixie said to the stranger politely, but I would greatly appreciate if you could spare me a moment. I'm embarrassed to admit I have no idea what's going on, but it looks like they all just saw some rough action there. The man half smiled and frowned at the same time. I would have guessed that just by the look of confusion in your eyes, you would have considered the same thing, he told Dixie. My name is Antonario, but you are welcome to call me Ireo, as the contingent here likes to reckon me as. And what you say is true, although I personally did not see much of the action. I just came to bring up the rear. Luckily, the thick of the battle is past. Dixie had so many questions to ask, but as he asked what was going on, this Ireo was keen to avoid direct specifics, as if he was clever enough to show discretion. This fine folk just came from an encounter with the Redcoats, Ireo explained. They have been trying to retake the fort at Madras up east. Along with the lobsterback reinforcements, they took out a few regiments.
And from what has been reported, the redcoats seem to have got 2 multipliers with them,
he added with a frown. Uh-huh. Dixie nodded with a deep squint as he tried to absorb all of this, even though he had no idea what the man was saying. But where am I? He asked. I mean, I gotta be honest. I just saw this golden tower in the distance and all I wanted to do was reach it. I had no idea I would stumble in the middle of a bloodbath. What's it all for? Pretty soon it seemed obvious, even to Dixie, that he was not alone in his pondering. He saw more clusters of battered troops pass by fast, many wearing French colonial uniforms and all going to his left. Most of them were muttering in confusion at what must have had happened. Dixie wished he could have been more relieved and alarmed to have stumbled onto these folk, had not so many of the troops coming through the forest been sporting massive head wounds or blood-stained bandages wrapped around some important areas of their body. For some of the warriors, it was as if these bandages were the only things holding everything in place. The man on the rock said nothing, but solemnly watched a procession of individuals walk by. Luckily, those who were actually coherent enough to speak and didn't look like they were ready to pass out from the shock of whatever battle they had just endured, they just kept whispering to each other about how bad things were going for them as they walked by.
I say it's for principle we hang on,
a fugitive cried as he stumbled along with another friend.
The redcoats started this whole stupid mess.
At this point, I'd just settle for leaving them alone if we could, said another. We need to beg them and tell them we just want our original territories back. If we can't find a way out of this realm, then maybe at least they would leave us alone and we can all just be done with it. Done with what? Called out Dixie, but the poor reprobate had already walked by. Done with what? He asked his new acquaintance, who remained sitting on the large rock as they both observed the procession of wounded soldiers.
Well, I realize that you're not part of this contingency,
replied Aryu.
You obviously do not know what a multiplier is. I will not even ask yet what you are doing here. So this is going to be hard to explain,
he added with a slight pause, as if to think carefully how to elaborate to Dixie the situation in front of them.
What you see here is a massive case of live-action role-playing gone bad,
he said as he stretched out his long legs and let them dangle over the large rock while stroking a tomahawk attached to his bandolier. What do you mean? Dixie asked.
This,
answered Iryu with a slight helicopter twirl-type gesture with his index finger pointing up.
All of this, the redcoats attacking these good people here. Those redcoats they all speak of are gangsters. But I understand. You would think they truly believe that the French and Indian War is still going on.
The French and Indian War, Dixie repeated with disbelief. We need a parley, sir, one of the refugees passing by shouted to the stranger. Yeah, cried several others. If we can't find a way to escape this place, we really need to consider a treaty of surrender. The stranger said nothing in reply, but watched the disgruntled soldiers march on by and disappear further in the woods. More were coming, and nobody looked happy. Dixie just watched. There was nothing else he could do to help them. He would have offered to carry a couple of supplies for a few of these men, but he knew he needed some answers first, so he just watched helplessly as more waves of soldiers poured on by. He noticed some of them were women, but they didn't appear to be faring any better treatment than the other fugitives. Morale is dying once again, the rugged stranger named Iryu whispered. It's like a virus that can't be fully cleansed. Keep your spirits up, he shouted as he tried to encourage the procession. Some things may work out for the better. This may not have been in vain. This distraction may have brought us an opportunity. Fuck that, sir! came a reply from someone in the crowd.
Yeah, I'm not feeling so hot about that, sir.
Another soldier replied. He had a massive neck wound and was missing a hand, and he was bent over as he carried a bag of rifles in a sack.
We've run out of gas.
Dixie was trying to do his best to soak this all in. French and Indian War? Dixie blurted involuntarily to the stranger on the rock. Yes, sort of, said the stranger. But this is not the best place to explain it all. The French and Indian War, though? Yes. You know, the one fought in the mid-18th century that plagued the American colonies for years. Some of the newer enemies fighting these fine men and women believe that this is all real because they have come out of the ground and have been told it was real. Well, what on earth does that mean? Asked Dixie as a couple of the last fugitives passed by. Upon overhearing their conversation, some of them stopped to pause and stare at the talk the buckskin warrior was having with this potato head-shaped kid. I really don't understand any of this, Dixie added, and it seemed some of these onlookers were inclined to agree, even though they were thinking about something completely different. Several ran up to Iryu as if wanting to get inside information about something. Maybe I can explain, said another one of them slowly. He must have been in his late 20s and had a clean shave and long blonde hair pulled into a bun. He seemed curious about Dixie. He looked battle-weary, but apparently he was also interested in venting out his anguish. You're obviously not from around here, he said to Dixie, who nodded in reply. We have been fighting these redcoats for years, and we give them hell, the soldier told him in a defiant voice. Our contingent group here actually is a large organization of Civil War reenactment and LARP players. That is, live-action role-playing players. You know. Dixie nodded. He was familiar with the term, but this was all so strangely absurd. Then one day, our union president got an invitation by a mysterious philanthropist, the man continued. The man invited us to take part in this massive reenactment battle staging a full-scale reproduction on the siege of Fort Loudoun of 1760. It took place right here in nowhere. Nowhere? Dixie asked, somewhat confused. Anakaland, Iryu elaborated with raised brows. So wait, this is Anakaland? Dixie cried excitedly. That's amazing. I mean, I wasn't sure, but that's a relief right there. He almost wanted to jump for joy. The stranger called Iryu seemed troubled by Dixie's reaction. It looked like he wanted to correct him, but he let the refugee soldier speak. There was a catch, the soldier continued. A catch? Interrupted Dixie. I still don't get it. You mean that this battle you were part of was a bunch of amateur actors, but it was actually real? How did you end up here? It was more like a massacre, actually, interjected another soldier who had just stopped. You see, we were duped. For 4 years, we've been surviving the onslaught of redcoats up here that keep marauding and slowly dwindling down our numbers. We originally thought they were hired actors just like us, continued the first soldier. But after the first official battle we took part of, and with the realization that a third of us had been killed. Just like that, for real! Oh, interrupted the other soldier. We fled back onto an empty fort and barricaded ourselves for months from their onslaughts. The first soldier continued. Real bullets, continued the second soldier. Those bastards use real bullets. They're sadists, too. Despite their large numbers, they didn't seem intent to siege the fort. Yeah, we were really relatively safe there, I guess, said a third soldier. The fort was fully equipped and well stored with supplies for many seasons. It's almost as if whoever organized this sadistic event wanted us to live for a long time and deal with the onslaughts. Yeah, for target practice, sick bastards. But what gives? Asked Dixie. You're telling me that those other actors are really not actors? Dixie had not yet, luckily, encountered any of these redcoats during his travels through Anakaland. After hearing some of these fugitives describe their slaughtering campaigns, he was filled with a sense of dread. Everything started to become clear. At this point, the ground began to descend again. There was a growing haze amidst some of the trees further below, but to his great relief, he could distinguish jagged-looking ruins all over the forest floor. The scattered remnants of a civilization certainly were a welcoming sight. Again, he heard the thunderclaps repeatedly coming from the area he was heading towards. They were getting louder. Come on, man, he said as he tried to psych himself up. It can't be any more dangerous over there than that skydiving door or getting chased by zombies. He forced himself to continue through the woods. It was good that at least he was thinking positive. The ruins he was passing by in the woods were battered remains of many constructs celebrating 18th century French colonial architecture. Dixie's book, Esoteric Myths, had briefly touched on the existence of these monuments. Somewhere in the deep valleys of Anakaland, it said, lay a region where it was still believed the French and Indian War of the 1700s was still going on. The author had speculated that entire communities of French colonials, redcoats, and Native Americans had somehow been caught in a time-space warp during some foul play with black magic in the ancient Americas. Something about hearsay from other reports. Although, of course, this would have been strange, seeing how, well, Anakaland was nowhere near such regions. How any of that was possible was beyond the author's skill to explain. But here was Dixie walking amongst ruins that fit those descriptions. And what these buildings were doing here was a complete mystery to him. But he was relieved to find familiar human settlements, at least. Another louder clap of thunder was heard. Or was that cannon fire? Followed by what sounded like an explosion and a sudden faint shriek that emanated from the valley ahead. It was all too unnerving, and it was coming from the direction Dixie was heading. He passed more pine glades and occasionally what looked like the ruins of a stucco building of some sort with a few of its walls missing. As he studied one of them, it was evident that it had suffered a shelling. In another spot around the woods, Dixie would pass by piles of old wagon wheels or various ancient monuments half buried in the ground. They were covered in moss and looked so weathered that their features were almost indistinguishable. Some of these appeared as the shape of a warrior standing on a podium with what either looked like a long pointy helmet or an enormously long pointy head. Others were holding a short staff, while others looked like they were carrying some sort of ancient rifle. Other monuments were the busts of someone's giant head. In particular, the giant heads all appeared to resemble the same large face. A bearded young man with unkempt hair and wearing a low-fitting rimmed hat that looked like the kind a Cuban soldier or some expendable South America guerrilla soldier movie extra would be wearing in a bad action film. Dixie considered if the bust was a familiar face he should be able to recognize. But the white limestone was so corroded that half of the statue seemed to be missing any further distinguishable facial features. After a 15-minute trek further down, Dixie stumbled onto an elegant leather boot, which was most unexpected. It would have seemed a welcoming sight had it not been for the fact that upon further inspection, it still had a leg in it. "Saint Mother of Earth!" screamed Dixie. "That's the most messed up thing I've seen and I've seen a lot of effed up, fucked up things." Leaving the boot, Dixie immediately thought about heading back up the slope. But just like a person who hates their daily routine but doesn't do anything about it, Dixie felt destined to continue down the valley towards the haze. After another 30 minutes down a slight decline through some half-blasted pine trees, the ground started to flatten out a bit. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of bedlam became more frequent. Dixie stared at his magic cell phone thingy. Still, no reception. There was probably no reception in this valley anyways.